I'm back on the latest version of our project, and now I want to talk through the code a bit. I want to make sure that everything kind of makes sense, or maybe totally makes sense, and hopefully answer some questions that might have been bouncing around in your head. So we're going to take a look at our 4 scripts that we have and see what we can learn that maybe we haven't learned already, or what we can kind of figure out from these just reviewing them. We're going to start with the water script. We'll start right at the bottom and work our way up to the top. So our water script was very basic. It doesn't have a lot to it. It's got a couple lines up at the top that we haven't really talked about at all. It's got the definition of the class, the public class water, and that colon and the mono behavior, which, if you remember before, I told you is the thing that we need to make it be possible to have it as a component. If I don't have the word mono behavior in there, this water just won't work as a component. I won't be able to put it onto my objects. In fact, let's see what that looks like. Let's delete out the colon and mono behavior. I'm going to save, and look at this. I've already got an error. It says get component doesn't exist in the current context. And that's because get component is part of the mono behavior. So let's just comment this out too. I'll just put 2 forward slashes and I'll save again to make it so that I can compile. We don't have an error at least, and go back over to Unity. If I go into here now and I select my water, I'm going to see that my water component has disappeared. Oh, it says, yep, there's now a missing script, I guess. It didn't completely disappear. It says the associated script could not be loaded. Please fix any compile errors. If I remove this component because it's no longer working, and I try to re-add the water by dragging it over, it's going to tell me that I can't add the script water. The script needs to derive from mono behavior, which means that it needs that colon mono behavior. So I'm going to reopen it. Actually, let's go into source control, and I'm going to undo my change in Plastic SCM. So I'm going to go to Plastic SCM, find my pending change, right click on the water, and hit undo changes. That's going to revert or undo my water deletion, or my water line mono behavior part deletion. If I go back to the water script, let's go find that water script here. You can see it's reattached, and the code is back. So we've got the colon mono behavior, which again tells it that it's a component that can be added to a game object. And then inside of here, inside of the braces, which is inside of our class, this brace is the start of our class, this brace is the end of our class, we have one method, the on trigger enter 2D method. Again, if we build a 3D game, we'll use 3D components. So we'll use a rigid body and an on trigger enter and a collider. In 2D, we always have to use the 2D ones. We have the on trigger enter 2D that passes in a collision, or an object named collision that's actually a collider 2D. And a collider 2D is any of these colliders, a polygon collider 2D, or if we look at our player, a capsule collider 2D, anything that's a collider 2D like that could be an object that's passed in. And that's because all of these classes, these capsule collider, polygon collider, etc., they all also inherit or derive from a collider 2D class. Now you can't see that. Well, you can if you try to dig into it, but you don't need to see that. It's not something that's visible, but they essentially look like something collider 2D, colon collider 2D in their code. So it's going to pass that collider in, and then we just play the audio because we don't care what hits the water. So we get the audio source component, and then we tell that audio source component to play. Now what happens if we don't have an audio source component here? Think about this for a moment. If we don't have an audio source component attached to our water, what's going to happen on line 9? Well, if you think about it for a moment, what's actually going to happen is get component for audio source is going to return back nothing. It's going to return back null or no object or nothing at all. And then it's going to try to play on nothing, and that's just not going to work. You're going to get an error saying there's a null reference exception. It's the most common error that you're ever going to see, so it's something that you're going to want to address. So why don't we just make a quick change here and make sure that we have an audio source? And to do that, we can add a question mark and save. What that will do, and this is a cool little trick, is check to make sure that the thing to the left of the question mark is not null or does exist, so that we actually get one back, and it will only run this play method if we have an object here, so if we got something back. So I guess cool little review and a little tip or trick. something that you should probably understand, and we're going to be using quite a bit throughout our game development. And if you've never seen that question mark there and you've only seen the dot, hopefully this clarifies it quite a bit. It just checks to make sure that the component or the thing, doesn't necessarily have to be a Unity component, exists before calling the method on it. Let's save that off and then go commit our change to plastic. So we've added a null check to our water script. That's what we're going to say. Go to plastic SCM, say added a null check to the water script when playing audio on trigger enter, and check that in. So let's go on to our next script. We'll go back to the project view and take a look at our spring. Our spring was a little bit different. Our spring doesn't get the audio source every time we touch it. In fact, we cache our audio source, which is something we might want to consider doing for our water. It also caches our sprite renderer and our default sprite right here in this awake method. So right at the beginning of our execution or our life cycle of our spring object, we save off all of these different components. And we do that for ease of coding in case we want to use it multiple times, but primarily for performance. Calling this get component every single time will eventually cause performance issues. It's not going to cause performance issues for our game, even if we did it every single time, but it's a very important habit to get into, just caching this, because if we build anything bigger, we start to scale up, or we want to start to target smaller devices, lighter platforms, and we really need to get into the habit of optimizing this performance, and it's very easy to do. We're going to talk a lot more about performance later on. So we cache all three of these things in awake, and one of those things is not a component. It's actually the current value of our sprite renderer's sprite. So our sprite renderer is the component, and we get the current sprite and use that as the default. Remember, that's the unsprung version of our sprite. And then we use the onCollisionEnter2D methods instead of onTriggerEnter, because we have these set up as actual colliders, and they're colliders that are set up to be bouncy. So when we land on it, it bounces our player. And remember how we do that in just a moment. We'll go take a look at it. But when we hit the object, we actually check to see if the thing that hit was the player by using the compare tag method. And if so, we swap the sprite and then play an audio boing sound. And then when we leave the collision, so when our player bounces off away from the spring, we set the sprite back to its default value. So that's why we cached the default sprite. Let's go take a look at that spring again. We go look at our spring. We've got our box collider, and its material, remember we created a physics 2D material, is set to spring, and that value has a bounciness of 1 and a friction of 0. Let's go look at that spring one more time, see what other components we've got. So we've got our box collider, we've got our spring with that sprung sprite on it, and then we've got the audio source. So that's pretty much all we needed for the spring. It's nice, it's pretty tight, it's a simple little script. So let's jump over to one more script. We'll take a look at our spikes. Our spikes are very simple. They also use the onCollisionEnter2D, and here we check to see if a player hit, again using that compare tag, and if so, we load scene 0, which is again just loading the first scene in our build index. Let's go take a look at both of those things. First, let's see our player, and remember that we've got this player tag in the tag section. Remember, that's different from layers. Layers are used for collisions and physics, and tags are used for game logic. We can also access layers for game logic if we want, but usually tags are kind of the default for that, at least the player tag. That's a very common tag to have. So we've got our player tag here, and then we've got our file, build settings, and our scenes to build. This is where we got that load scene 0. Notice the 0 right here. That's the build index. So level 0 is this one. We could also load it by calling the name, saying load scene, and then passing in quotes level 1. But we're going to do more level loading in our next set of sections. So for now, we're just going to close that out. And I think we'll wrap it here and then continue on to the player script in the next section.